The relationship between the United States and China is often described as the defining geopolitical challenge of the 21st century. Both nations are nuclear-armed superpowers with global interests and ambitions. Economically intertwined, they are also locked in a strategic competition for influence and power. This rivalry, while often managed through diplomacy and international institutions, has grown increasingly tense in recent years. Disagreements over trade, Taiwan, and the South China Sea have fueled mistrust and raised the specter of conflict. The risk of miscalculation, accident, or unforeseen escalation is a constant threat. In this environment, even a minor incident could spiral into a larger confrontation. The hypothetical scenario of a full-blown war between the US and China, while undesirable and hopefully avoidable, demands serious consideration. The consequences of such a conflict would be devastating, not just for the two nations involved but for the entire world. In the opening salvos of a hypothetical war between the US and China, cyberspace would become the first battleground. Both nations possess sophisticated cyber capabilities, capable of disrupting critical infrastructure and sowing chaos. China might target US power grids, financial institutions, and communication networks. Simultaneously, the US could retaliate against Chinese military command and control systems, aiming to blind and confuse their adversary. Beyond the digital realm, the initial hours would likely witness limited but strategically significant military strikes. China, aiming to establish control over the Taiwan Strait, might launch missile attacks against Taiwanese air bases and radar installations. The US, in response, could deploy naval assets to the region and potentially target Chinese naval bases on the mainland. These opening moves would signal the start of a broader and more dangerous conflict. As the conflict enters its second phase, the geographical scope of the war would widen. The US, leveraging its network of allies in the region, might activate defense agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, drawing them into the conflict. China, seeking to exploit its proximity, could attempt to seize disputed territories in the South China Sea and cut off vital shipping lanes. Air and naval battles would escalate, with both sides deploying advanced fighter jets, warships, and submarines. The risk of miscalculation and unintended escalation would increase dramatically. Cyber attacks would intensify, targeting civilian infrastructure and further disrupting global communications and commerce. The world would watch in horror as the two superpowers exchanged blows, the conflict threatening to engulf the entire Asia-Pacific region. Section 4. Economic shockwaves, immediate impacts. The economic consequences of a US-China war would be felt immediately and globally. China, as the world's largest exporter, would see its supply chains disrupted, causing shortages of goods and raw materials. The US, heavily reliant on Chinese imports, would face inflation and economic recession. Global markets would plummet as investors panicked, leading to a global financial crisis. Energy prices would skyrocket as oil and gas supplies from the Middle East were threatened. The interconnected nature of the global economy would ensure that no nation would escape unscathed. The economic pain would be felt most acutely by developing countries, which rely heavily on trade with both the US and China. The war would exacerbate existing inequalities and potentially lead to widespread humanitarian crises. Section 5. Political upheaval, the first 24 hours. The first 24 hours of the conflict would witness intense political activity and upheaval. Within the US, public opinion would be divided, with some demanding a strong response and others urging restraint. The president would face immense pressure to act decisively while also avoiding further escalation. Congress would be embroiled in debate, authorizing military spending and potentially declaring war. In China, the Communist Party would likely use the conflict to consolidate its power and crack down on any dissent. Nationalist sentiment would run high, making any diplomatic solution more difficult. The international community would scramble to contain the crisis, with the UN Security Council likely paralyzed by vetoes from the US and China. The world would hold its breath, hoping for a swift end to the hostilities.